It's everyone can see this fine. Thanks. Hi, and yeah, thank you, Katrina and Emily and Ross, if he's out there, for, well, first of all, the generous introduction and inviting me to talk about the Catholic Gothic. And perhaps this is cheating a little bit, but I want to turn the title around and talk about the Gothic Catholic instead. Both are, by the way, tongue twisters, so I'm going to try and not say the words out loud too often. Anyway, Gothic Catholic. Very simply put, the question of the evening is how Gothic was Catholicism in early 19th century Britain? What was so Gothic about Catholicism in Britain's final decades as Catholic mission territory before Pope Pius IX restored diocesan hierarchy in 1850, a hierarchy that had been gone since the 16th century, since the Reformation? And I think that's an interesting question. I think so, because in this period, so roughly between 1829, when the so-called Catholic Emancipation Act granted Catholics full legal rights again, and 1850, so when the Catholic dioceses were reinstated, was also a period in which Catholicism as a religion, but also as a community based on practices and beliefs, went through far-reaching changes globally and in Britain. And I think some of those changes in Catholic culture may sound pretty familiar to you Gothic aficionados. They are a growing emphasis on the Middle Ages as a period of inspiration, aspiration, horror as well. A preoccupation in Britain with the continental other, a fascination for the body in its materiality, in its sensuality as well. So the blood and the bones, and we'll get back to the blood, plenty of that in a moment. Also the increasing importance of authentic, spiritual, affective experience in religion, and the very grey, but also the very fertile area between the holy and the horrific. I've turned the title around also because scholars of Gothic fiction, and I know that if we were sharing a physical space right now, I would look meaningfully into the audience at this point, but you scholars of Gothic fiction know much better than I do how, as a literary genre, the Gothic rather, is suffused with these themes and tropes. From the chapel in Walpole's The Castle of Otranto to countless lecherous monks and perverse nuns, arguably even to the horrors of a Black Mass in Huysmans Là-Bas, which was published in 1891 and translated into English as The Damned. So these tropes return, I would say, throughout the long Gothic century. So I won't be talking about Gothic fiction, beyond pointing out, as Diana Houveler has expertly done in her book, The Gothic Ideology, that the Gothic borrowed from popular anti-Catholic tropes. Although Maria Purves, also an excellent book, offered a revisionist take on this dynamic between Gothic literature and anti-Catholicism. So I won't be talking about any of that, or these books, nor Patrick O'Malley's excellent book. But before we move on, I would like to mention one good illustration of how this Gothic literary tradition didn't exist in a cultural vacuum, nor was it restricted to fiction. In 1829, so when the Catholic Emancipation Act was passed, the book Female Convents, Secrets of Nunneries Disclosed appeared, which was edited by the Protestant patriot Thomas Roscoe. It's a book rife, as you can see from the quote, it's a book rife with detailed, very lurid descriptions of the secret life of nuns. And it may as well be a Gothic tale, but it was meant as a powerful piece of anti-Catholic, anti-church propaganda. And I give this as an example, not only because it's a good example of widespread anti-Catholicism at the time, but also because it shows how, in my opinion at least, how Gothic elements were part of a much wider cultural frame of reference that both fed into anti-Catholic sentiments, but also fed off it, yeah. So why is that? And I think to an extent, and we're now moving into my core business, and I keep looking at the crosses behind Katrina for some reason. I think part of it is because of these early 19th century shifts in Catholic culture and religious experience more generally, and in relation to mysticism and the supernatural more specifically. And so one way to answer the question of how Gothic Catholicism was in this period is to look at the experience and the reception of specific types of the supernatural. And I did originally want to include a whole range of unpleasant Catholic phenomena for your pleasure, like in the incorruptibility of corpses, demonic possession, but I think I'd be happy to, but we'd be here till midnight probably. So instead, I'll just be drawing from my book, which Katrina has already mentioned, and I'll just show here because my publisher has kindly asked me to, a supernatural body. So it's a book on stigmata. For those who don't know, stigmata are the wounds of the crucified Christ as they show on other people's living bodies, which arguably I would say is, by most standards, makes it pretty Gothic. Also because of some of the elements that I've already touched upon. So the history of stigmata starts in the Middle Ages. In a way it starts with Jesus, but technically as a phenomenon that can be defined as the imitation of Christ, it starts in the Middle Ages. It's a very visceral, transgressive, often very sensational phenomenon. The wounds of Christ on people's bodies speak to the porosity, the leakiness of the human body. They're about suffering, they're about sanctity, and there's a certain eroticism there in that they suggest always a bodily union with Christ. And they bleed. That's also worth mentioning. It is actually quite disappointing, I think, that Gothic writers haven't done more with stigmata. When I was asked to give you some reading, I was looking for Gothic fiction that featured stigmata quite heavily, and I couldn't really find all that much. So if anyone has any tips, I'd be happy to hear from it. I do feel that at this point it's my duty to point you all in the direction of the 1999 film Stigmata with Patricia Arquette and Gabriel Byrne, which is a film that very effectively uses supernatural wounds to tell a Gothic Catholic story. But maybe it's best to watch it when there's not a historian of stigmata in the room. So stigmata, surprisingly to me at first, became a topic in discussion, topic of discussions rather, in early 19th century Britain, which struck me. And I think part of the reason why is because it came to symbolize in very effective ways the Catholic other. If, as in Roger Luckhurst's definition, the Gothic also came to mean the dark medieval past, which included a Catholic taste for miracles that many considered preposterous or unseemly or superstitious, the medieval origins of stigmata made it a prime subject with which to charge Catholicism as a whole with a negative energy. It highlighted those elements of Catholicism rather that were not considered, or that were considered not modern, not Protestant, not British. You see here St. Francis. Stigmata first appeared in Italy in the 13th century on the body of St. Francis of Assisi, who received them from a seraph. You can vaguely make out a crucifix-shaped shape. This is great here, in the clouds, which shoots divine rays onto St. Francis's hands, feet, and side, in imitation of Christ's crucifixion. And Francis' stigmata have been described by religious historians of the period, at least, as a turning point in Christian devotion. So away from an intellectualized mysticism and towards a mysticism that would also center the experience of the body and the emotion in religious experience. So Francis set a trend in some ways. And it also meant that this late medieval Italian context was where stigmata was thought to belong. In 1782, the Welsh antiquarian Thomas Pennant traveled from Chester to London. On the way, he saw an effigy of Hugh Pachel, a 13th century bishop of Coventry and Lichfield, and the effigy showed Pachel's hands pierced as if by nails. Pennant, ever the typical antiquarian in all his opinions, described those stigmata as respectful superstition, safely quarantined in ancient times. And that sentiment of stigmata as a medieval Catholic superstition appears also, somewhat surprisingly actually, in multiple chronicles of general English history from the late 18th century on and into the 19th century. And those chronicles discuss, surprisingly to me at least, at some length, a case of self-inflicted stigmatization in 1222, so 2 years before St. Francis, and in England. At a church council during Holy Week, the Archbishop of Canterbury faced a superstitious, rude countryman, as the chroniclers at least described him, someone who showed in his body and limbs, that is, in his side, hands, and feet, the 5 wounds of one crucified. The man also claimed to be the Messiah reborn. The man was punished, so the chronicles were keen to point out, by immuring between 2 walls. Immuring was itself a trope in Gothic stories about convents and monasteries, by the way, that raised also in the 19th century some questions about whether it actually ever happened. This is just a screenshot of an article from 1889 that was asking this question. So anyway, it's interesting to me that at some point in the late 18th century, chroniclers of English history found it important enough to go into detail about what happened with this man in 1222. And one reason I think historical anecdotes like these were suddenly being retold in such detail was because they situated stigmata in a faraway Catholic past, right at a time in history when this medieval style, bodily, exuberant mysticism was on the rise again. Miraculous healings, ecstasies, prolonged bouts of fasting, prophecies, stigmata, all manner of physical phenomena of mysticism that were thought to be drowned deeper than it did ever plummet sound in the sea of the past, suddenly came bubbling up on the surface, as one newspaper wrote with some dismay in 1841. And perhaps not wrongly so, between 1800 and 1950, at least 295 stigmatized bodies in Western Europe became public sites of devotion and controversy. That's a lot of bodies. And I was going to show you a nice map from a project database that I was part of from a couple of years ago, but apparently no one's paying for the server anymore. So you just have to imagine this is a map of Europe with a lot of dots on it. That's the best I can do. And it would convince you to show you that, or it would strengthen the argument that historians have sometimes made that they call this period the golden age of stigmata. From the 1820s especially, mostly young women, mostly from pious Catholic families, showed their supernatural wounds to audiences of devotees, skeptics, sensation seekers. And this early 19th century proliferation of what the French scientist of dreams, Alfred Maury, called ecstatic mysticism was framed to some extent as a type of Gothic revival, a return to medieval-style Catholicism, or medieval-style Catholic devotional culture, in which the body and the suffering of Christ, the Passion, took center stage. So it was framed as a revival, and historians have instead rather chosen to describe this era of ecstatic mysticism in terms of a reinvention or sometimes adaptation of medieval tropes. Unlike the majority of their medieval predecessors, for example, 19th century stigmatics were public attractions because they were lay women. This is the Belgian Louise Latour here. So their stigmata were not kept hidden behind convent walls. They were out there in public for people to see, even if the actual experience, the mystical experience of having Christ's wounds on your body was still intensely personal and intensely intimate. It was always exposed to the public gaze. So Nicole Prisching, who's a historian of 19th century mysticism, speaks in this regard of a reinvention of older mystical forms embodied by an ecstatische Jungfrau, it sounds better in German, an ecstatic young woman whose mystical reputation depended on the visibility of her body and her first-hand experience with the supernatural. So not on things like intellectual claims or authorship of spiritual texts or prayers. Maria von Merle, who you see in Ecstasy here, she was, for example, illiterate, so she won't have written anything. So despite differences like these, most well-known cases of stigmatization abroad were, in Britain at least, publicly relegated to the dustbin of a medieval dark age, to ancient times. They were living anachronisms from the time of St. Francis of Assisi. Stories of stigmatics on the continent were rhetorically potent instruments with which to brand the Church of Rome and its allegedly credulous members, both in Europe and in Britain itself, as living at odds with modern times. There's plenty of examples. This is a nice one from the period we're discussing. It was written in 1828. It was about the horrible state of society in Sardinia by William Henry Smythe, a post-captain in the Royal Navy. And as part of this sketch of the present state of the island of Sardinia, he discussed the stigmata of a Capuchin nun, Maria Rosa Serra, and he included it in what is quite a colorful Catholic tapestry of what he called old customs and superstitions. So following Smythe, Sardinia is an island full of apotropaic amulets, magical objects, demonic possessions. Locusts were being excommunicated, I believe, and Maria Rosa Serra was stigmatized. And in this account, the nun's supernatural body marked an important cultural difference between his England and all countries where Roman Catholic religion was or is predominant. The nun's wounds and her body also illustrated, typically, in his view, Catholic deceit. And it's worth checking out this report from Sardinia, because it is written almost as if it is a Gothic story set in Sardinia of a man who travels around and encounters a wide range of interesting elements. But he also pointed out that the nun's bleeding from hands, feet, side, and head conveniently coincided with the election of a new abbess in the convent, which she just so happened to win, convincing people that she was the chosen one. So in Smythe's panorama of Sardinian so-called superstitions, Maria Rosa Serra embodied popular anti-Catholic tropes: the power-hungry Mediterranean nun, bodily deviancy in the convent, supernatural trickery. The thing was that even despite the antagonism with which authors such as Smythe wrote about the supernatural bodies of Catholics abroad, it's still often translated into fascination at home. So often when someone keeps insisting something is despicable and perverse, it triggers people's interest. So the emphasis on elements that we might call Gothic, the body, the horror of the blood, the perniciousness of nuns, actually appealed quite a lot to cultural tastes in Britain at the time, not least also because it confirmed familiar stereotypes of Catholics. So readers were appalled and enthralled in equal measure. Also, for instance, when reading about a Franciscan nun who people had seen flying, and I couldn't find an appropriate picture, so my apologies for this. But anyway, in 1835, newspaper reports appeared in Britain about a nun who was seen flying while bleeding from her stigmatic wounds over the rooftops in Madrid. And the press reveled in the details. So they talk about the moonlit rooftops, they talk about the blood, they talk about the flowing robes of her habit. They talk especially about the Franciscan friar in the convent who was supposedly pulling the strings behind the scene to paint a picture rather that is quite a complete Gothic picture of Catholic trickery and deceit. And I'm including this because, true or not, The Flying Nun was not Gothic fiction. Neither was, for instance, Catherine Crowe's 1848 collection of true stories, as she calls it, The Night Side of Nature. Crowe dedicated the concluding chapter to well-authenticated instances of stigmata, which she called a remarkable example of the power of mind over matter and of the veiled department of nature. The popularity of The Night Side relied on Crowe's reputation as a horror writer. Her descriptions of famous stigmatics of her own time evoked the horrifically Catholic. She placed them in a Gothic tableau of ghosts, spirits, and poltergeists. So Crowe's stigmata stories, Smythe's account of the superstitions in Sardinia, the newspaper reports on flying Spanish nuns were all non-fictional, but they were read alongside penny dreadfuls, featuring the bodies of monstrous abbesses and deviant friars. They were read alongside cheap reprints of older popular Gothic Catholic stories, such as Matthew Lewis's The Bleeding Nun of the Castle of Lindeberg, which was in the collection The Monk, a short story that was set in a familiarly horrific and exotic monastic setting. It's a story about a spectral sister who met a gruesome end, and it combined well-trodden anti-Catholic tropes of immured nuns and demons in the garb of a monk with supernatural bodies. There are scholars, in fact, who have looked at the story of the Bleeding Nun and have argued that the nun's wounds are, in fact, a satirical take on the stigmata. And who am I to say differently? Well, I don't quite buy it, but I won't say it again. Anyway, these sensationalist accounts of stigmata across genres, from short stories to travelogues to anthologies of true events, should be read in the context of popular anti-Catholicism in Britain in the aftermath of the Emancipation Act of 1829. Effigies of the Pope were burnt in the streets. All types of cartoons and things circulated like this. And at any instance of problematic supernaturalism, at any instance, actually, when something supernatural happened in Britain, from poltergeists to belief in witchcraft, those events tended to be branded popish credulity. Historians have mostly studied anti-Catholicism in this period as a political force, but as a broader cultural moment, it was defined, at least to some extent, by anxieties about supernatural excess as a symptom or even a strategy of a meddling pope who saw an opportunity to finally reconvert Britain. In a lecture against morbid spectacles of Catholic supernaturalism in 1847, the Anglican canon of Chester, Hugh Stowell, went so far as to insist the Pope was the Antichrist. And such opinions were bolstered by the arrival of Italian missionaries, often barefoot or on sandals, in cities like Manchester and Liverpool, and who were, like Dominic Barberi, who is pictured here, treated by local Catholics as miracle workers, as people who boosted supernatural beliefs and practices. Barberi reported to his superior that not even in Italy have I come across a more fervent people. They kneel down in crowds just to receive my blessing. And that was a cause of concern for many people. To many Catholics and non-Catholics in Britain alike, no one embodied the image of a Gothic medieval-style Italianate mysticism more than two women in their 20s, bedbound in isolated villages in the Alps. There's a story behind these two pictures, which I'll keep for afterwards, perhaps, if people really want to. But from the late 1830s, rumors reached Britain about Maria von Merle on the left, and Maria Domenica Lazzeri on the right. Both women were said to levitate, prophesy, go into ecstatic trances, live on nothing but the Holy Communion, and bleed from the wounds of the crucifixion every Friday afternoon. Soon, they were better known also in Britain by their Italian nicknames, the estatica on the left and the addolorata on the right. So the ecstatic and the suffering, or I think that's a fair translation. They became famous as bodily vessels of the divine and as living saints. And they were not alone, by the way. Other lay women in the same region, so in the mountainous border region between the Austrian Habsburg Empire and what later became Italy, possibly dozens of women were bedbound in hovels, experiencing stigmata on a weekly basis, though it's very difficult to figure out exactly how many. And they would show their stigmata to audiences. They transformed the region into what has been called the Holy Land of Stigmata. One Anglican reviewer of a popular publication about these women described the region as the heart of the papal dominions, and that was not meant as a compliment. British fascination with these two peaked with the publication in 1841 of a letter from the 16th Earl of Shrewsbury, who was a prolific Catholic who had financed the building of neo-Gothic cathedrals in Birmingham, Nottingham, Southwark, and a whole range of chapels in the Midlands. This letter was a very detailed and euphoric eyewitness account. So newspapers and magazines ran it across the English-speaking world. It was read in Australia. It was read across the United States. And it was often circulated with inlaid images that were copied from illustrations that were sold in the villages themselves. So it's an eyewitness account. In May 1841, Shrewsbury traveled into the Alps with his wife, and he returned, and he was convinced that he had seen the most, as he called it, the most extraordinary object in existence, and the most striking supernatural personification of the sufferings of the Redeemer. What he saw precisely was not just bedridden virgins displaying holy wounds. He also noticed that the social and the religious impact of their mystical celebrity on Catholics who had come from all over Europe to look at the stigmata in person. And what he picked up quite cleverly, I think, is that to many, the women in their bedrooms embodied a purer medieval religious experience, untainted by reason, and made all the more authentic because it was visible on ailing bodies of young women. So Gothic Catholic tropes were not just anti-Catholic ammunition. Catholics like Shrewsbury also played them out in a positive light. The copious blood, the pale skin, mumbled prayers in Italian, the stifled air, the darkness in the bedrooms, all these elements contributed to the atmosphere of holiness. So there is another eyewitness account, again, which is quite Gothic in the way it tells the story. It's from a British family, the aristocratic Dormer family, who traveled there in 1841 as well, and whose account describes how their 10-year-old son had to be carried outside into the fresh mountain air after he had fainted from the smell of dried blood. So you can imagine what type of sensory experience this also was. It's in a way a sensory experience as a not just within the bedroom, but the whole act of getting to them as well, because it's a remote mountain region. So the mountain landscape was also singled out as an essential Gothic aspect of the whole Catholic supernatural experience. The wilderness itself became sanctifying. So Italy was often depicted as a repository of so-called medieval supernatural phenomena, and the Tyrolean Alps, where these villages were scattered, were depicted as a sublimated Catholic landscape, encrusted with rituals and miracles, almost as if it was only natural that people were having the stigmata all over the place, because look at the landscape. It was a biblical landscape. In 1846, a visiting Catholic priest wrote to the Catholic Herald of the deep dells and the towering mountains and the falling water and the roaring torrents and the silent rivers and the murmuring brooks, green slopes, precipitous rocks, dense roads, and the ever-recurring image of the crucifix, or the crucified Lord rather, on the roadside meeting us. So this jagged landscape, which the Earl of Shrewsbury said was rather Nazareth than Jerusalem, was said to harbour the purest and most exalted faith in the world. The ecstatica and the adolorata were extensions of this landscape. The what he called rude, wild, and desolate scene conjured up a biblical landscape in which the most marvelous of Rome's modern wonders were still possible, just as they were entirely impossible in modern Britain. That was the message. But were they impossible in Britain? I feel like I should dim the lights a little bit now, but I can't. Shrewsbury's letter brought stigmata into the mainstream in Britain. It triggered widespread fascination with the ecstatica and the adolorata. It inspired Anglicans to make the journey. Those Anglicans who in Britain had assumed that supernatural popery was a thing of the past had been lulled into a false sense of security. People now started to think the snake is fast reviving. The alleged anachronistic medieval character of the famous stigmata abroad did not reduce them to harmless things, but made them all the more insidious. So you see in the aftermath of Shrewsbury's letter, newspapers and commentators step up a notch to say things like the English mind has no true faith in the supernatural, while the English mind, if we want to call it that, was totally fascinated by anything, any little detail that came out of the Tyrol. And this fascination threatened the carefully conceived narrative of England as a rational nation and of English people as having no interest in Catholic supernaturalism. So popular eyewitness accounts, such as that letter imported Catholic credulity from Italy and fostered it in Britain. That was the narrative. But worse, as I said, Anglicans began to travel to Tyrol, and worst of all, stigmata could lead to conversion. In 1842, Charles de Laet Waldor-Sipthorpe, a reactionary ultra-Tory who had opposed Catholic emancipation in 1829, became a Catholic, allegedly after reading Shrewsbury's letter. This was, in essence, a real Gothic horror, the idea that monstrous medieval miracles infiltrated Britain from abroad, from popery's cradle, to disrupt ideas about British progress and national identity, and to expose the rot within a supposedly rational Protestant society. And maybe I'll just end with a little cliffhanger here. The dramatic language in lectures and sermons about those stigmata in the Tyrol in the 1840s, and that's language of dams of reason being breached and torrents of foreign superstition washing over Britain. All that talk and all those sermons and lectures failed to acknowledge how a couple of years earlier, in 1837, a prophet roamed around Kent with the wounds of Christ on his body, the first stigmata on British soil for centuries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristof. We've got lots of virtual applause. I can totally hear happening. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. And I love the cliffhanger ending.